Hello everyone, this is Anugrah Rao. Welcome to the 7th episode of the Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft Art of Code. Microsoft Art of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. As you know, we are learning fundamentals of HTML5 and CSS3. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science, and those who are interested in coding, app development, etc. can join as well. A basic understanding of HTML, CSS and design is essential if you want to go any further on the web. These episodes have everything you need to upgrade your skills. As we already told you, that these courses are not only beneficial for students, but also for working professionals. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Bob Tabor from Microsoft, who is an expert in HTML, CSS with us. He is going to talk about everything you need to know about HTML5 and CSS3. But before we start, you need to have a computer system with a 64-bit processor or 32-bit processor. Other required tools are Windows Notepad or any web browser, such as Internet Explorer. Now, let's move towards the course. In the previous episode, we covered series introduction, creating HTML5 web page, styling HTML5 web page with CSS3, understanding the HTML5, working with paragraphs and texts, in which we covered coding part, relative path, global attribute, semantic names for classes, defining the structure of document, working with figures and images, in which we learned defining an image, working with lists, creating tables, creating forms, form validation and other future HTML5 form enhancement, understanding cascading style sheets and CSS3 font and text properties. Now we will move towards CSS3 and color background properties, CSS3 list and table properties, CSS3 box properties, working with CSS font face and embedding videos in HTML5. So let's get started.
In this lesson, we'll talk about color and background related CSS properties. Now, some HTML5 elements can have a foreground color or just color, while others can have a background color, while others can have a background image, and that image can be configured in a number of different ways. So to kind of exercise this, I created another one of my little experiments like I talked about in the previous lesson, where I went through and just created every variation possible so that I could get this firmly ensconced in my mind as the differences, what the different values were possibly, and be able to talk about this intelligently. Great exercise. I highly recommend that you do something similar to this for yourself. Create a little cheat sheet. Okay, so we're going to start with various ways to define color in CSS, and there are quite a few actually. The three ways that I have demonstrated here are defining using named colors like blue, black, white, red, so on. And there's quite a few. I think there's I don't know, 120, 240. It's several dozen different ways, and you can just search for CSS color named, and Bing will bring back some websites that have a definitive list of every possible value you could look for, and that's the way I usually do it when I go about to work with colors. Or you can use a hexadecimal value, and a lot of applications like Photoshop, and my preference is Fireworks, but there are other tools as well that use hexadecimal values whenever you're kind of laying out what your web page might look like. And then there's also RGB values, which stands for red, green, blue, and the combination of those values between 0 and 255 will create every color that's possible, at least, you know, are web safe anyway. There are a number of other different ways to define colors as well. RGB percentages. There's something called HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. Then there's RGBA and HSLA, which include alpha transparency as well. And so, for me personally, I stick with either name colors or hexadecimal values for consistency's sake. Still, if you're so inclined, you're probably more likely, if you have a tool that automatically generates these values for you, then you can use any of these ways in defining a color in CSS. So you can see that in several of these cases, I work with div tags. If you were to look at the HTML for lesson 14, and the div semantically is probably correct for this because we're not really giving any true meaning to our document, just a general area that we can style, so I feel good about that. And you can see in this case I have the style attribute and I start defining inline the various styles. So in this case I set a background color as well as the sizing of the div itself and the margins for spacing purposes or what have you. That's not as interesting as the actual values we've set here. For example, using a hexadecimal value, I can get a light gray color in my div. Here I'm going to set background images. Background image set to none, leaves it empty. Or I can use an image, in this case a 50 by 50 image. Where did I get this from? It's a funny little utility that somebody put out there called placekitten.com. And you can use these as placeholders on your web pages. You just send in a width and a height formatted like so, and it will give you back an image that you can use temporarily on your website as you're going through development. Okay, so I just used that for this purpose. So you can see by default it will tile your image to fit the space available within your block style element. We'll talk about block style elements when we talk about block properties 2 lessons from now. Okay, here we can set the properties of the background. By default you can see it will repeat, or we can set repeat X to only tile our background image using the X-axis or vertically, or rather horizontally, and then use the repeat Y value to repeat that tile vertically, or we can use the no repeat, which will only put the image in your background of whatever element just one time. Furthermore, you can set the background position so that you can position it, in this case, right top, left bottom, and so on. There's also a background attachment. However, it seems to be only applicable to the entire web page, and so I didn't create a firm example of this. You can see how it's used here. There's 2 possibilities, scroll and fixed. The scroll means that the background image does scroll with the page, whereas fixed means the background image does not scroll when you scroll the web page. Okay? And then finally, I wanted to point out that many of these CSS properties will accept shorthand. So you can kind of stack all of the settings on a single line if you want to. Same thing with border, as we'll see, and I think font has that capability as well. In this case, you just need to put the color or image, optionally put the position, optionally put the repeat, optionally put the attachment value, and so on, and it will figure it out. Okay, so that's really all I have to say about it. Again, a valuable exercise for me. Background colors, background images used often in web development. Make sure that you're at least familiar with the various properties, and then just experiment as you're building your web pages. So hope that helps. See you in the next video. Thank you. In this lesson, I'll briefly point out the CSS properties that are unique to lists and tables. Pretty simple ideas. I just want to be thorough and create a little cheat sheet for myself so I really understood the options for these. Again, I encourage you to do the same. Take a look at lesson 15.html, available to you for download wherever you downloaded or are watching this video right now. And what I did here was merely look at all of the list and table specific CSS properties and then exercise them in a number of little examples. So what I want to do also is open up this in Notepad so we can take a look at the styles. Now I did cheat a little bit here with the table because it got a little hairy to put all this stuff inside the table definitions themselves. So just keep that in mind that I have table 1, table 2, table 5, table 6 defined. I also have some specific things like first row and first column, and we'll dissect these in just a moment. For the list items, notice that I'm using the style attribute and then defining the styles inline like so. So let's go ahead and start with the lists, and notice that by default whenever we create an unordered list, the list style type is disk, but there are other options as well that we can set, like none, for example. And we use none whenever we want to use the unordered list items as a horizontal menu. So we've already seen how to do this in lesson 3 whenever we took our unordered list, made it into a horizontal listing, removed the bullet points. So that's what setting list style type to none will do for us, remove the bullet points from our list items. Also, you can see there's a circle, square, decimal leading 0, upper Roman, upper alpha, and so we can create a pretty rich indentation scheme using list items, which is awfully neat. There's also the ability to create a custom list item. So using the list style image, we can use an image instead. So I just use a URL with an open and close parentheses and then point to a valid URL. We talked about place kitten in the previous lesson, so I'm just using a 10 by 10 place kitten and a 50 by 50 place kitten to show how each of them kind of could be used in a series of list items. Also, line style position, whether we want to be on the outside or the inside of an imaginary indentation line with the bullet itself. And then I demonstrate a shortcut for list style so that you can kind of put all of these on one line instead of separating them out into separate CSS property definitions. All right, so that's it with lists. Pretty simple stuff. Tables are a bit more complex because of how many optional parts there are. As I note on the web page itself in this little explanatory section, I said basically that great table design is really the domain of a talented designer. However, it's important to know what your options are when you're trying to match a designer's stylings. So let's take a look at the examples that I put together here, and let's scroll down to the first example in our source. And here we are. Okay, so I have a table with an ID of table 1. I've created a caption, and then I create a row with several, it looks like 3 columns, another row with 3 columns. So it's a very simple table. And if we take a look at the stylings for this in table 1, we're simply putting a 1 pixel solid black border around it. So let's see, that goes around the entire table itself. Let's kind of put these side by side if we can. Border spacing of 1.5 EM. So every time there's a border involved, it will create an extra space. And then I'm also setting the caption side to the bottom, which is neat. All right, so let's compare that with table 2. Now let's take a look at the source for table 2 here. All right, and table 2 is almost identical in structure. In fact, it is identical. The only thing that changed was the settings for each of the individual data cells. So you'll notice here that as it says, I apply a 1 pixel border around each of the cells, and I set the border spacing to 1 pixel. So the space in between each of the cells, called the border, has a 1 pixel boundary. And as this points out, this could be removed using the table's cell spacing equals 0 attribute. So if we were to go down on table 2 and add an attribute, cell spacing equals 0. Let's see what that'll do for us. And you can see we get the border, but we get no space in between. All right, so let me go ahead and remove that and just put it back to its original state here. And moving on to example number 3, it says here I'm applying a background color to an entire row. Notice that we still have the 1 pixel border space like we did and we fixed just a moment ago. And it says we'll fix that in the next example. So in table number 3, let's look and see what's different about it. Notice that the first row has a class called first row. That's about the only thing that's different. And then we defined the tr.firstRow to have a border around it, set the border spacing, but then also set the back color to that medium gray color. All right, and that's what we get. So that's how we were to define a color for one entire row. Here we're going to work with an entire column, and I think, if memory serves me correctly, that looks a little bit different. So let's go down to example number 4, and notice here we have a series of columns defined. And I didn't talk about call groups and columns, but it is a way to define up front the various columns that will then be used by the TDs and THs inside of each of our TRs in the body of our table. So I call the first column, I give it a class name of first column, and then give the last column a class of last column, and then I style up the first column like so. So here again, set the border and then the background color, and that allows us to style, to set an entire column's background color. Okay? Finally, let's go, or I guess we're nearing the end here. In examples 5 and 6, we play with the border collapse attribute. Setting it to separate will double the borders between the cells. So notice how thick the borders are between each of the cells. And the reason is because we set the border collapse to separate in table 5, but we set it to collapse in table 6. So the difference between the two is, in separate, let each of the borders be rendered out, but when it's collapsed, if there are two borders that are butted up next to each other, only represent one border. So that's the difference between having a 2 pixel and a 1 pixel border, all things being equal. All right, and like I said, there are so many variations and so many additional things that we can set with regards to the T-body, T-head, T-foot, call group, calls, and so on, not to mention IDs and classes. That there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice tables, and it really is a matter of your imagination how you want to render and represent tabular data on screen. Okay, so that's all I have to say about lists and tables, or styling them up with CSS properties. We'll continue on in the next video. We'll see you there. Thank you. In this video, we'll discuss the box model and the CSS properties that you can modify on box style elements. What do I mean by box style elements? Well, throughout the series, I've split up HTML elements into 2 categories. There are elements that are used in line, inside of, for example, a paragraph of text. Here's a quick list of those that we've covered that fit into this category of being in line. The anchor, the code, the M, the I, the U tags, the image, the label legend, the nav, the small, the span, and there's quite a few others, okay? These inline elements take up an amount of space as indicated by the line height and the font size, the weight, and so on. Then there are elements that are used to produce a block of space on the screen. Typically these are used as containers that hold other items, but not always. But here's a quick list of box style, or rather block style elements that we've covered that fit into this category. The article, the aside, the body, the div, the definition list, definition term, and definition description, field set, figure fig caption, footer, form, head, H1, H2, H3, and so on, header, H group, and so on. Okay, and there's quite a few others as well. This is not a comprehensive list. So take a look at this diagram. This should hopefully help you see the fundamental difference between inline elements and block style elements. You'll see that in the simplest terms, the biggest difference between inline and block is that inline elements flow horizontally, and then when they reach the border of their parent element, they employ a soft line break to wrap to the next horizontal line. But block elements stack vertically on top of each other. Now there's some other offshoots of that idea, like setting their float either left or right, and when you set the float, then there's more horizontal space, and the block elements will attempt to fit next to each other from left to right or right to left, depending on their float and the amount of horizontal space available. We'll see some examples of this in this lesson, but for the most part, think stacking vertically. All right, for this lesson, we're interested in the CSS properties for block elements. Let's talk for a moment about the box model, and in particular, the fundamental parts of the box or the block. So you can see there's a diagram here that I've created to help us understand this a little bit better. Alright, so let's start by talking about the different parts of this diagram. First of all, in the innermost section is the content area itself. The content area contains your text or images or whatever content you are going to place inside of this box or block, okay? And they have two dimensions, a width and a height. Outside of that, there is a padding between sort of the edge of the block or the box and the content itself. Behind all of that is a background. In this case, the background is set to white. Then there is a border. In this case, it's the light gray color. And it takes up a certain amount of space as well, and it extends sort of the footprint, I guess you would say, of the blocks or the box. And then I don't have an outline shown here. We'll see some examples of outline, but it's similar to the border, but it doesn't add any space to the total width and the height, or the total footprint, all right? And then there's a margin, and you can see the margin I've used indicated by a white, thick, dashed area around our block, and it's the space between the bordered or backgrounded area and any other elements on the page, which you can see indicated by text that wraps around this particular block. All right, so that in a nutshell is the box model, and being aware of how adding padding and margin as well as an outline add to the total footprint or the total width and height of that given block or box. Okay? All right. So I guess the next question is, what properties can be set and adjusted on a block style element via cascading style sheets? Well, that's kind of the remainder of this lesson, and I created another one of my little experiments here, the lesson 16 experiment. Let's go ahead and just open that up, and we'll walk through each of the given parts of this to better understand the propensities of a box or a block, and how we're able to modify it using padding and margins and floats and things of that nature. Okay, so it'd probably be helpful as well to look at the source code for this in some cases. So I'm just going to keep that open here to the left hand side. Alright, so you can see first of all in example 1 I have a very simple div with a 200 by 200 dimensions here, and I put some text inside of it. In the second example I have another 200 by 200 div. However, it's quite a bit larger, as you can see in your browser. Why is this so? Because it has a 10 pixel padding and a 10 pixel border, and so you can see the net result is about 40 extra pixels because you have 10 and 10, 10 and 10 width, and the same would go with the height as well. Okay? In the next example, kind of 3 and 4 go together here. We have 3 divs that have a value inside, and by default their display value is set to block, so display colon block. However, in example 4, I've set display colon inline, and you can see how they now line up next to each other. So it's the difference between block, which again stacks vertically, versus inline, which stacks horizontally. All right. And the same thing would be true with the H3 tags. Notice that by default they display colon block. And so you have 3 H3 tags. Notice that they by default take up 100% of your of the width of the page. However, we're able to change that by changing their display value to inline, in which case they butt up right next to each other. Pretty cool. All right, so in example 7, I show you how prior to popular frameworks that have come out within the last couple of years, designers used to use this floating of divs in order to create various sections in a grid-like structure on their web page. So let me scroll down here in the source so you can see what I did to achieve this. You can see that, again, I'm styling everything in line here, which shouldn't be a surprise if you watch the previous lessons. I only do this to keep the styling in the context of each example. Otherwise, you'd have to cross-reference between a style sheet and the HTML page, and I didn't want to go through all that for these simple examples. But never, ever, ever put inline styles in your own web pages. Okay. All right. So start over again. Here we have a let me do a quick review here. Okay. So first of all, we have a div, and this first div contains a paragraph, and that div has a width of 30% and floated left and a margin right of 10 pixels. So that's this area right here, and it creates a little margin area so that the next paragraph doesn't butt up right next to it. All right, then we have, sort of in the main middle area, another div. Its width is set to 50% and it's floated to the left as well. Doesn't butt up because of that 10 margin border. Now the beauty of this design is that as I change the scale of my or the size of my browser, everything stays pretty much in line. It'll fall apart when we start getting really small here, or we reduce the width. You can see that text starts running on over each other, and it just doesn't scale extremely well, but in some cases it does okay. All right, and then off to the right hand side, notice I'm floating to the right. I have a width of 15% containing a little navigation area. Okay, and so that is, again, a very common approach to laying out web pages. There might be a little bit more to it. People take a little more precaution, but in a nutshell, that's what they're essentially doing. Now, one thing I wanted to point out here, you can see that I have an HR, and I set its clear both for its style, and I explain why this is. Notice the HR tag in this example has a clear both applied. Use this to clear out floated elements. So if you try to remove this, and I'll just temporarily remove it, Control X on my keyboard, I'll save, and now I'm going to refresh this page. Notice what happens to the HR. It tries to put it next to the last floated item, and so it makes it a very small element on the page because it's trying to stack it, floating it left, and as a result, it's floating up against the other two floated items, and it just doesn't work well. So by adding the style clear both, you're clearing out the floats for that element, and therefore it begins a whole new kind of line, horizontal line. It removes itself from the current from the previous floats, and it goes on to its own layer, I guess you could say. All right. All right, so then let's move on from there and take a look at some of the stylings that you can apply to your block style elements. And we'll start out with border styles. And you can set a border style none like we do in this first div, or a number of different border styles. And let's just see, I just made the borders 10 pixels wide all the way around. So here's a solid border, a dotted border, a dashed border, a double border, and then there's a number of these that kind of have a double border with an outside and an inside color. Here's a groove and a ridge an inset and an outset. All right. Okay, and then moving on, there's this notion of overflow, and you can see that there are 4 different settings for overflow. And this will come in handy whenever you have too much content to fit inside of a block style element. In this case, I've set the overflow equal to auto, and by doing that, you can continue to see all of the content, but it's rendered inside of the div, and there's a scroll bar that's added so you can get to all of it, which was a common technique used years ago. I don't see it used quite as often today because it obscures the fact that there is more content, and I don't know that you would want to just create all your web pages this way, but it's certainly a possibility. The Overflow Scroll will add scroll bars horizontally and vertically. If there's just text, all it will do is just try to create line breaks and allow you to scroll one direction. But if you had an image, you'd be able, that was larger than the size of the block that you have it contained inside of, then you would also have enabled this horizontal scroll bar. Overflow Hidden means that anything that doesn't fit into the boundaries of your div tag or your block style element will just get cut off. The opposite of that is Overflow Visible, where it'll go ahead and just spit it all out, and it doesn't use any scroll bars. It just puts it beyond the borders of your block style element, which is not preferable, I wouldn't think, in most cases. But it might have special application if you're just having a trouble formatting it any other way. Okay, example number 10, padding and margin. Here on a, let's see what example number 10 looks like. Alright, so you can see in an H3 element, I'm styling margin left 50 pixels. Okay. And you can see that I have another one of these shortcuts where we can set the top, right, bottom, and left. So think about a clock beginning at midnight. So top, right, bottom, left, and you can specify each of those values without having to set margin left, margin top, margin dash right, margin dash bottom. All right. All right, example number 11. I've used this a number of times. This is how we would center something using the margin left and margin right set to auto. Okay. Padding on all sides 20 pixels, and again you can use a shortcut here setting the pixel count top, right, bottom, and then left, and don't forget that the padding adds to the overall dimensions of the content area. Alright, something new in CSS is rounded corners, and so you'll see some websites that make use of this. Here I have a border radius of 10 pixels on all sides. I think that's the right one, yes. And then I have the only on the left top and bottom right, and to get to those I set the border top left radius and the border bottom right radius to 20 pixels. All right, giving us a round on 2 corners. And I see this used often in header sections to kind of give a little stylistic flair, or in comment sections on blogs. Sometimes they'll use just certain corners to style it. Okay. And that degrades gracefully, so if you were to open this up in a browser that wouldn't support that, it would just see square corners. Alright, example number 14 shows the outline that is in addition to the border. Let's take a look at what I did here. I set the outline color to orange, the outline width to 10 pixels, and the outline style to double just to call attention to it. But notice that that is in addition to the border that I've created for this block style element. Alright, so you can have kind of a double effect then, a border and an outline. The outline does not add to the underlying margin, padding, border, and content area that makes up the width of your block style element. Alright, example number 15 needs some explanation because you don't see anything. That's because the visibility is set to hidden. Alright, so you can show visibility hidden or visibility visible. And that's a common technique that's used whenever you're applying JavaScript to show and hide elements on a web page. We'll talk about JavaScript in a whole other series that utilizes this technique. By setting the CSS property back and forth, it'll give you different ways to show and hide information on a web page, which is a common technique I see often on the internet. All right, and then finally, another CSS property that you can set is the cursor style that's used whenever you hover over a given element. And so again, this is probably used something that's a little bit more interactive, like when you're creating JavaScript applications on the client and you want to change, given the state, you want to change the classes that are added to or removed from a given block style element dynamically. You can also set then its various cursor states. So by default, it's just an arrow, but you can see I'm setting it to crosshair in this second example. Default help has a little question mark off to the right hand side. The move cursor, the pointer with the finger. The text gives a little caret. Let's scroll down a little bit more here. The weight, which can be just an hourglass, or in one of the newer versions of Windows, kind of that circle with that rotates. The resize, east, northeast, northwest, north, southeast, southwest, and south, okay, and west. All right, and so then you can also use a custom cursor, and I note here that it's risky to do because you have to download that cursor to the end user's computer, and who knows, there's a variety of reasons why that may or may not work. But if you wanted to do that, you can set it like so. So cursor and then that common URL with the open and close parentheses to access an external resource, and then if you can stack them so that if for some reason this won't load, you can just say, all right, well then just go back to the default so that there's some cursor visible on the screen, okay? All right, so that is in a nutshell the difference between inline and block style elements. Block style elements are represented by a box model. The box model has several parts. Content has background, padding, it has a border, a margin, may even have an outline, and so just keeping that model in your mind as you are working with styling up your web pages so that you can make the appropriate adjustments to make everything lay out just nicely. We looked at a plethora of CSS properties for the box, or rather block style elements, and we're getting close to the end. If you followed along this far, you're doing great. Hang in there, just a couple more lessons, and then you'll have the stuff on your belt. I would recommend, once again, if you haven't already decided to do so, take a few moments, a day or so, and create the little cheat sheet like I did. Fully exercise all of the CSS properties that are available for block style elements so that you really get this firmly cemented and under your belt. Okay? See you in the next video. Thank you. Designers often use typography to emote or communicate beyond the words of the headline or the paragraph. Until recently, their typographic choices were severely limited by the fact that you couldn't reliably choose fonts that would work equally well in everybody's browser or device. Now, there were ways to install decorative fonts on the end user's computer. However, it wasn't a reliable process and certainly not supported by all web browsers. Additionally, there was the added challenge of licensing a font correctly for use on the web. Now in CSS Level 3, the font face attribute, along with a healthy ecosystem of font publishers creating fonts for use strictly for the web, allows for a much greater choice of fonts for websites. Now obviously we're drifting here into designer territory, but I want to look at how you can employ the font face purely from a technical perspective. In most cases, whenever you license a font face style font created specifically for use on the web, they'll provide you some sample code that you can copy, paste, and then modify to suit your purposes. And that's exactly the technique that I want to demonstrate for this lesson. So what I want to do is start by looking at a company called Squirrel. They provide a wide selection of fonts that can be used for free, even for commercial purposes. And you see they even kind of note that here, only the best commercial use free fonts. Now, even so, you still want to be aware of the licensing terms and abide by the agreement that they set forth. If none of the free ones that are available suit your needs, then there are clearly dozens of publishers that would love to sell you a non-free font, and there are plenty of them out there. Okay, so let's take a look at what it would take to include a decorative font on a fictitious website that we're working on. To get started in this example, I have a folder called Lesson 17. You should be able to download the zip file containing this folder from wherever you're currently watching this video or from wherever you originally downloaded this video. There is a before folder, and we're going to want to copy the two files and paste them in the work folder where we'll do the majority of our work. If we open up lesson 17, you can see that it's simply a very simple web page. The paragraph has been supported, has been styled using the styles.css style sheet. I simply used a font family setting Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif to the paragraph, and now what we want to do is apply a decorative font to the title, to the H1 of this web page. All right. So to do that, actually, let's start back over here on the font Squirrel. Okay, and what I want to do is take a look at the popular fonts. And I love this Good Dog font. I think it's kind of a neat hand-drawn font. I'm going to go ahead and click View to review all of the individual glyphs that are a part of this font, and I think they're just really well done. So what I want to do is click on the Font Face Kit over here on the right of this little bar. I could review the license and look at the character map, but I'm ready to go. So I'm going to click on Font Face Kit, and you can see that we can choose a subset of the font face kit specifically for different font formats. What are the different font formats for? They give you a little cheat sheet here on the right hand side. Fonts that work in most browsers, those that work in an Internet Explorer, those that work in other mobile devices, and so on. I'm going to go ahead and allow it to choose the entire plethora of fonts that are available, and I'm going to click the Download Font Face Kit. I'll save it to my Downloads folder. I want to view my Downloads folder, and I'm going to go ahead and actually, let me just open it up from here. All right, there we go. And I'm going to drag this onto my desktop, double click it. I can see the files inside of it. What I really need to do is extract those files out. So I'm going to right click and select Extract All, or use your favorite method of extracting zip files. Click Extract, and now we have a folder unzipped containing all of our information. If we click on Demo, you can see it does indeed display the demo web page, and that's exactly what we want to use as kind of a template for what we're trying to do with our own web page. So if I were to right click this and open with Notepad, and I think that, you know, if you turn on Word Wrap, at least you can see it all. They've compressed everything, so it's a little bit difficult either way, either reading it on one line or reading it in this word wrapped manner to kind of see what's going on here. But I can make out a couple of important features. First of all, there's a stylesheet.css that we're going to need to look at. Furthermore, there's this h1.fontface where they're setting a font using a font family called Good Dog Regular, which I'm going to assume was created in that style sheet. Furthermore, if we look at the if we look at their H1, it has a class of font face, so that's where this is applied. And then there's a P style 1 that also uses the Good Dog Regular, and you can see it's styled using this class equals style 1. Okay, so I think at this point what we need to do is probably pull from a couple of different places. Let's go to the style sheet, open with Notepad. And here again, it's all on one line, not very helpful for our purposes. So what I'm going to do is format this a little more nicely. And every time there is a logical break, like a semicolon or a comma, I'm going to go ahead and put my cursor right after it, and then hit the Enter key on the keyboard, and that will retain most of the styling for me, like so. Now it's comprehensible. I can read it and understand what's going on here. Awesome. And what I see here is that it's creating a font family called Good Dog Regular, and it will associate that the font face Good Dog Regular with the following actual font files: the EOT file, the WOFF file, the TFF file or TTF file, and the SVG file. All right, and some additional styling as well. So what I'm going to do is just copy this entire section, hit Control-C on my keyboard, and then what I want to do is go to my, let's see, let's close everything down here, and go to my Lesson 17 folder. And in my work folder, I'm going to just paste, or actually I'm going to go into styles, open that with Notepad, and then paste that font face right here in my styles. All right, so this is only half the equation. What I need to do now is create a style that utilizes this new font family that was defined. And to do that, what I'll wind up doing is like a H1, and we'll call this H1 heading. And I'm going to take a cue from the example page that they provide in their demo. And let's turn the word wrap back on so we can find it again here. And so in their h1.fontface, this is how they define their font. I'm going to go ahead and just copy that onto my clipboard and then minimize it, and we're going to go back here and Control V. All right, so here we're setting for h1.heading, so a heading class that I'll have to associate in my h1 here in just a moment. It will utilize that good dog regular font face. Let's go ahead and save that. I think we're done here, so we'll close that down. And I think we're done here, so we'll close. Well, I think I'll need to get back to that actually. Now, the last thing that I need to do is shut that down. Shut that down. Let's go to our work folder, our lesson 17. And what I want to do is put class equals, what do we call that? Heading? All right. And then the final thing that I need to do is to make sure I copy the fonts over. So I want to make sure to grab the EOT file, the SVG file, the TrueType font file, and the WOFF file. I'm going to copy those and put them here in my work directory. Now, obviously in a real website, I would want to put these in a subdirectory and kind of partition everything off. I wouldn't want to maintain a website where everything was mixed together like the way that I have it here. But for our simple purposes right now, this will do just fine. All right, so I think I have everything in place now. If I were to reopen lesson 17, I get our beautiful heading, the new font face using that good dog font. Awesome. Okay, so I think a couple of caveats here to keep in mind. First of all, you want to always be aware of the licensing terms for fonts, and if it says you have to keep a file in the same directory as the actual fonts themselves, then make sure you do that. Make sure you read any of the legalese and what the requirements are to properly license that free font or the commercial font. And then the second thing you need to be aware of is the size of the fonts. Some of these are quite large. Take, for example, the SVG document. It's 57K. That's a very large file. Some of them are quite a bit smaller, which is great, but still, most search engines now penalize web pages that take too long to load, so you want to be aware of that when you're designing a website, not to use too many of these external resources, or it might hurt your search engine optimization efforts. Okay. But at any rate, and also, I mean, you know, if somebody's dialing in and loading up your web page, it might take forever for the page to actually render out because it's waiting for all these external resources. All right, that's from a usability perspective, that's obviously a big deal as well. Okay, so at any rate, that's all that I have to say about font face. Hopefully, you can have some fun with that, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.
That's all for this episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. You can download the entire series code from the links given below. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your question on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights and also on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.